All right, let me tell you something wild. You think you know Family Guy? You think you sat through every single episode of Season 5, caught every joke, noticed every background detail, picked up on every single thing the writers snuck in there? I promise you, you did not. I have been down a rabbit hole so deep on this season that I genuinely lost track of time. And what I found is going to completely change how you look at some of the most iconic episodes ever made. So buckle up because we are about to go through some genuinely insane facts about Family Guy Season 5 that most people have never heard before. Before we get into it, I just want to say that Season 5 holds a very specific place in the hearts of Family Guy fans. This was the show at the peak of its confidence. The writers had already proved themselves. The characters had settled into who they were. And the creative team was pushing boundaries in ways that honestly television had never really seen before. This was the season where Family Guy stopped just being a funny cartoon and started being something that people genuinely talked about the morning after it aired. And when you start digging into what actually went on behind the scenes, in the writing room, in the animation process, in the decisions that got made about specific jokes and storylines, the whole thing gets even more interesting. So let us start with something that sets the tone for this entire season. The 5th season of Family Guy premiered on September 10th, 2006. Now that seems like a simple enough piece of information, but what makes it fascinating is the context around it. The show had already come back from cancellation once at this point. Fox had canceled Family Guy in 2002 after 3 seasons. And it came back in 2005 due to incredible DVD sales and strong ratings on Adult Swim. So by the time Season 5 rolled around, Seth MacFarlane and his team were operating with a very different kind of energy. They were not just making a show. They were making a statement. They were proving that they belonged back on television, and that attitude bleeds into every single episode of this season in a way that you can absolutely feel when you watch it. Now here is something that a lot of people either do not know or have completely forgotten. Season 5 is the season that gave us the episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which was a 2-part storyline that actually aired as the season finale and then the season premiere of Season 6. The production of these 2 episodes was treated with an almost movie level of seriousness by the creative team. The writers spent an enormous amount of time figuring out how to make both outcomes feel genuinely surprising while also being internally consistent with the characters. The animators put extra work into specific sequences that were designed to feel more cinematic than a typical Family Guy episode. When you watch those episodes back knowing that information, you start noticing things that you might have glossed over before. The lighting choices in certain scenes, the way specific camera angles are framed. There is a level of craft in those episodes that goes beyond what the show usually did. Let us talk about something a little more unexpected. The episode titled Chick Cancer, which is Season 5, Episode 7, contains what many people consider to be one of the most technically ambitious musical numbers in the history of the show up to that point. The production of that sequence involved a significant amount of coordination between the writers, the music department, and the animation team. What most people do not realize is that musical numbers in animated television are not written and produced the way you might imagine. The music typically gets recorded first, then the animation gets created to match it, which means the comedic timing of every single visual gag in a musical sequence has to be locked in before the animators even start drawing. The team working on Season 5 had become incredibly skilled at this process, and it shows in how tight and precise those moments feel. Here is a fact that absolutely blew my mind when I first came across it. Seth MacFarlane does the voices of Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Quagmire, among others. That is pretty well known at this point, but what is less talked about is the sheer recording demand that a season like Season 5 placed on him. He was not just the lead voice actor, he was also the showrunner and one of the primary writers. There were days during the production of Season 5 where Seth MacFarlane would spend hours in the recording booth doing voice work, then transition directly into writing meetings or editing sessions. The creative output required to maintain that level of involvement across an entire season of television is genuinely staggering when you think about it. And the fact that the quality of the show remained as high as it did throughout the season speaks to something remarkable about how that team operated. Okay, here is one that is going to get the real fans excited. The episode called Road to Rupert, which is Season 5, Episode 2, continues the road to tradition that the show had been developing since the Road to Rhode Island episode back in Season 2. These Road to episodes were always treated as special productions within the show. And Road to Rupert was no exception. The episode follows Stewie and Brian on a road trip to Aspen, Colorado to recover Stewie's stuffed animal Rupert after Peter accidentally sells him at a yard sale. What makes this episode fascinating from a production standpoint is how the writers balanced the comedic elements with genuine character development for Stewie and Brian. The dynamic between those two characters was something the creative team was very deliberately nurturing across this season, laying groundwork for emotional payoffs that would come later. Something worth noting about Family Guy Season 5 that does not get discussed nearly enough is the show's approach to celebrity cameos and references during this period. By Season 5, the show had developed a very specific philosophy about how to use celebrity appearances and references. Rather than simply putting a celebrity in an episode to generate buzz, the writers were much more interested in subverting expectations and using celebrity culture as a target for satire. Some of the references and cameos that appeared throughout Season 5 were planned months in advance with very specific comedic goals in mind. The writer's room for Family Guy was known for being a place where ideas got challenged and stress-tested before they made it onto the screen, and that process really shows in how layered some of the jokes from this season are. Now I want to talk about something that gets into the technical side of animation because I think it adds a whole new dimension to appreciating this season. By the time Season 5 was in production, the animation pipeline for Family Guy had become significantly more sophisticated than it was in the early seasons. The show uses a combination of traditional seal animation techniques and digital tools, and the team had spent years refining how those two approaches could work together. One of the things this allowed them to do in Season 5 was execute cutaway gags with more visual complexity than had been possible earlier in the show's run. Some of the more elaborate fantasy sequences and parody scenes from Season 5 episodes required coordination between multiple animation teams working in parallel, and the results are visible in how polished those moments look, compared to some of the rougher edges you can sometimes see in the earlier seasons. Let me drop another fact that I genuinely did not expect to find. The episode titled No Meals on Wheels is Season 5, Episode 14, and it deals with Peter opening a restaurant called McBurgertown out of the Griffin home. What makes this episode interesting from a behind-the-scenes perspective is that the premise originally went through several completely different versions before arriving at the version that aired. The writing team at Family Guy was known for a process of developing multiple directions for an episode premise before settling on the one that gave them the most comedic and narrative opportunities. The restaurant premise apparently provided so many different comedic avenues that the writers had a difficult time narrowing down which jokes and storylines to prioritize. The version of the episode that ended up airing represents only a fraction of the material that was developed for it. Here is something that connects to a broader truth about how this season worked. Season 5 of Family Guy is notable for how it handled continuity. Now, if you are a long-time viewer of the show, you know that Family Guy is not exactly famous for strict episode-to-episode continuity. Characters age inconsistently, events from one episode are sometimes ignored in others, and the show generally prioritizes the joke over narrative consistency. But Season 5 actually made some deliberate choices about which character developments to carry forward and which ones to treat as isolated incidents. The ongoing development of Stewie's relationship with Brian is the clearest example of this. Across the season, you can trace a through line in how those two characters interact that feels intentional in a way that reflects careful decisions being made in the writer's room about what the show's emotional core should be. All right. I promised you some facts that would genuinely surprise you, so let me get into one that I think is going to land differently than you expect. The Season 5 episode called Peter's Two Dads, which is Episode 10, digs into the question of Peter's actual biological father. This episode involves some of the most personal writing in the entire season, according to people who have discussed the creative process around it. The theme of fatherhood and identity is something that resonated with multiple people in the writer's room, and it shows in how the emotional beats of the episode are constructed. There is a sincerity underneath the comedy in that episode that feels different from a lot of Family Guy content, and it is not accidental. The writers were deliberately reaching for something that would connect with viewers on a level beyond just making them laugh. Something that gets overlooked when people talk about Family Guy Season 5 is the role of the supporting cast. Characters like Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire had been part of the show since the beginning, but Season 5 made some specific choices about how to use them that shaped what those characters became going forward. Quagmire in particular was given material in Season 5 that added complexity to a character who had previously been used mostly as a one-note joke delivery vehicle. The writers were testing different versions of who these supporting characters could be, and some of what they found in Season 5 directly influenced the spin-off shows and character-focused episodes that came later. Let me give you a fact about the production timeline that adds some interesting context. When Family Guy Season 5 was being made, the production team was simultaneously dealing with the ongoing development of American Dad, which was Seth MacFarlane's other show on Fox. Managing 2 animated television series simultaneously is an enormous undertaking, and there were constant decisions being made about which creative resources went where. The fact that Season 5 of Family Guy is as strong as it is when you consider the competing demands on the creative team is genuinely impressive. Some people in the animation industry consider this period to be one of the most productive stretches in the history of Seth MacFarlane's career, precisely because of how much quality work was being produced under those conditions. Here is one that is going to get the internet arguing, which I love. The episode titled Barely Legal, Season 5, Episode 8, is one of the most discussed episodes of the entire season from a content and tone perspective. This episode involves Meg Griffin developing a disturbing obsession with Brian after he takes her to the prom, and it pushed the show into territory that even by Family Guy standards felt transgressive. What is interesting about this episode from a writing perspective is how it handled Meg's character. Meg Griffin has always been the show's punching bag, the character whose misery exists primarily to be laughed at. But Barely Legal, while certainly playing some of those same notes, also gave Meg a kind of desperate emotional honesty that the writers did not typically bring to her storylines. It was a strange combination of uncomfortable comedy and genuine character work, and it is one of the reasons Season 5 feels different from the seasons that came before it. Now here is something about the music of Season 5 because the music in Family Guy is so much more carefully crafted than most people realize. The show has always had an unusually sophisticated musical component for an animated comedy, and Season 5 elevated this even further. The music team for Family Guy during this period was responsible not just for original compositions, but also for the elaborate parody arrangements that show up throughout the season. When Family Guy takes a well-known piece of music and turns it into a comedic moment, that is not as simple as it sounds. The arrangements have to be close enough to the original to trigger recognition in the viewer, but different enough to serve the comedic purpose of the scene. Getting that balance right requires real musical skill, and the team working on Family Guy Season 5 was exceptionally good at it. I want to circle back to something about Seth MacFarlane that I think adds real depth to your understanding of this season. By Season 5, MacFarlane had developed a very clear philosophy about what Family Guy was supposed to be doing. He was on the record in various interviews during this period talking about the show's relationship to classic Hollywood entertainment, particularly old musicals and the kind of comedy that was popular in the 50s and 60s. MacFarlane genuinely loves that era of entertainment, and his attempt to bring some of those sensibilities into a modern animated show that was simultaneously pushing boundaries with edgy and transgressive humor creates a very specific tension that defines Family Guy at its best. Season 5 is probably the clearest expression of that tension in the entire run of the show. You can watch an episode from Season 5 and see moments of genuine, old-school charm sitting right next to jokes that would have been considered completely untouchable anywhere else on television. Let me throw another interesting production fact at you. The animation of Family Guy is handled by multiple studios, with the primary production handled domestically but significant portions of the actual animation work done overseas, which is standard practice for American animated television. What makes Family Guy interesting in this context is how the creative team maintained quality control across that distributed production process. By season 5, the oversight systems that had been developed for the show were working extremely well, which is part of why the visual consistency of the season is so high. Some earlier episodes of Family Guy have a slightly inconsistent look between scenes that reflects the challenges of that distributed production model. But by season 5, those issues had been largely ironed out. Okay, here is one that I find genuinely fascinating from a cultural standpoint. Season 5 of Family Guy aired during a very specific moment in American popular culture. 2006 and 2007 were years when the landscape of television comedy was changing rapidly. Reality television was at the peak of its cultural dominance. The internet was beginning to reshape how people discovered and talked about entertainment, but had not yet fully disrupted the traditional television model. Family Guy existed right at this interesting intersection where it was still primarily a television show in the traditional sense, but was also developing a second life online through clips and discussions that were happening on early video sharing platforms and forums. The writers were aware of this, and it influenced how certain jokes were constructed during season 5, with some gags designed to be funny in the context of the episode, but also to work as standalone moments that could be shared and repeated. Here is a fact about the writing room that I think every creative person is going to find interesting. Family Guy has always been known for its large writer's room, which is somewhat unusual for an animated show. But many animated comedies operate with smaller creative teams. But Family Guy brought in a significant number of writers who came from very different backgrounds. Some had experience in traditional sitcoms, others came from sketch comedy, some were primarily known for their theatrical writing. This diversity of influences is part of what gives Family Guy its distinctive texture. Where you will get a joke that feels like it belongs in a classic sketch comedy show, immediately followed by something that is almost surrealist in its construction. Season 5 is a particularly good example of how that mix of influences produced something genuinely unpredictable. Let me talk about an episode that I think is underrated in discussions of this season. The episode called Hell Comes to Quahog, Season 5, Episode 3, 2, involves a megastore called Superstore USA coming to Quahog and putting Peter out of a job at the shipping company. What makes this episode interesting is how it engages with economic and cultural anxieties about corporate consolidation and the death of small-town commerce. Family Guy was never a show that wore its social commentary on its sleeve the way something like South Park did. But Season 5 in particular has a number of episodes where the satirical underpinning is more coherent and pointed than the show usually attempted. Hell Comes to Quahog is a good example of this. There is a real idea at the center of that episode that the comedy grows out of rather than simply existing alongside. Something I want to make sure we talk about is the character of Stewie Griffin and how Season 5 handled him specifically. Stewie had gone through some evolution between the early seasons and Season 5. In the early episodes, Stewie was primarily a one-note joke machine built around the premise of an evil baby with world domination plans. By Season 5, the writers had moved away from that somewhat, developing Stewie as a more emotionally complex character with a specific and strange relationship to his own identity. Season 5 pushed this even further. And you can see the seeds of some of the most interesting Stewie storylines from later in the show's run being planted here. The writers were clearly interested in exploring what happened when you took this character who had been defined by one particular joke and asked deeper questions about who he actually was. Alright, here's a random fact that I love purely for how absurd it is. The amount of research that goes into Family Guy's historical and pop culture references is genuinely significant. The writer's room maintained extensive files of reference material that writers could draw on when constructing jokes. Some of the most obscure references that show up in Season 5 episodes required real research to get right, because the joke only works if the detail is accurate. There is a specific kind of comedy that Family Guy does where the humor comes partly from the specificity of the reference, And that specificity requires someone in the room to actually know their stuff. By season 5, the research infrastructure that supported that kind of joke had become quite well developed. Let me give you something that connects the dots between season 5 and the broader legacy of the show. Season 5 of Family Guy is frequently cited by fans and critics as one of the high points of the entire series run. If you look at ratings data and critical discussions from that period, you can see that the show was operating at a level of cultural relevance during season 5 that it has struggled to consistently recapture since. Part of this is simply the nature of long-running television shows, which tend to have a peak creative period and then find themselves in the difficult position of trying to maintain quality while the creative team exhausts their best ideas. But part of it is also that season 5 represented a very specific confluence of factors that was difficult to replicate. The creative team was firing on all cylinders. The show had the benefit of having come back from cancellation and was motivated to prove itself. And the cultural moment was exactly right for what Family Guy was doing. Here is one more production fact that I think you will find surprising. The sound design on Family Guy is something that gets almost no attention in discussions of the show, but it is absolutely crucial to how the comedy works. The specific choices about sound effects, the timing of audio cues, and the way music is used to punctuate jokes all contribute enormously to whether a given moment is actually funny or falls flat. The sound team for Family Guy during season 5 had developed an extremely precise vocabulary for how to use sound to maximize comedic impact. Some of the most satisfying moments from season 5 episodes, the ones where a joke just lands perfectly, owe as much to the sound design choices as to the writing or the performance. Now I want to get into something that touches on the show's relationship with its own continuity and mythology in a way that I think is genuinely interesting. Season 5 contains several episodes that function as what you might call mythology-building episodes, where the writers were laying foundations for aspects of the Family Guy universe that would be explored more deeply later. The two-part Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie storyline is the most obvious example. But there are subtler instances throughout the season where the writers were clearly thinking about the long game for specific characters and storylines. This kind of forward thinking was somewhat unusual for a show that had traditionally operated on a much more episodic basis, and it reflects the growing ambition of the creative team as they settled into their position as one of the most important shows on Fox's animation block. Let me drop one more fact that I think will genuinely surprise some of you. The table reads for Family Guy episodes, which are the initial read-throughs of scripts with the full cast, were known to be quite lengthy and involved. Scripts would frequently be significantly altered between the table read and the final recorded version based on what worked and what did not work when the words were actually being spoken aloud by the actors. Season 5 in particular went through significant rewrites at the table read stage for several episodes. Some jokes that made it through the writing process were cut entirely during table reads because they did not land the way the writers expected, and some moments that became iconic in the final versions were actually added during or after table reads because an actor's delivery of something improvised or slightly adjusted was funnier than what had originally been written. There is something I want to say about Brian Griffin specifically because Brian is one of the most interesting characters in season 5. Brian is the show's self-insert intellectual, the character who allows the writers to engage with ideas about culture, literature, and identity in a way that would feel out of place coming from Peter or Stewie. Season 5 used Brian in ways that were more emotionally honest than the show had previously attempted, giving him storylines that interrogated his pretensions and his failures in a way that was simultaneously comedic and a little bit sad. The writers were clearly interested in using Brian to explore something about the particular kind of person who considers himself more enlightened than the people around him, but consistently fails to live up to his own ideals. That is rich comedic and dramatic territory, and season 5 dug into it with real commitment. Here is a fascinating detail about how specific episodes from season 5 were marketed and promoted. Fox's promotional strategy for Family Guy during this period was very much focused on the edgier and more provocative elements of the show, because those were the aspects that generated the most discussion and controversy. But what is interesting is that some of the promotional material for season 5 episodes actually undersold what those episodes were doing creatively. Some of the most technically and emotionally ambitious work in the season was packaged as straightforward shock comedy in promotional materials, which meant that some viewers came in expecting one thing and got something considerably more interesting. This disconnect between how the show was marketed and what it was actually doing is part of what makes Season 5 such an interesting object of study. I want to wrap this up by zooming out and talking about what Season 5 of Family Guy means in the larger picture of animated television. The show arrived back from cancellation with something to prove, and Season 5 represents the fullest expression of what it proved. It demonstrated that an animated comedy for adults could sustain a level of creative ambition over an entire season, could balance outrageous comedy with genuine character work, could be both proudly lowbrow and surprisingly sophisticated within the same episode, or even the same scene. That combination is genuinely difficult to pull off, and Family Guy Season 5 pulled it off more consistently than almost any other season of the show. The people who made this season were working at the intersection of enormous commercial pressure, genuine creative ambition, and the very specific freedom that comes from knowing your audience trusts you. No. Every one of these facts we have talked about today points to the same underlying truth, which is that the thing you watched and laughed at and quoted to your friends was the result of an enormous amount of careful, deliberate creative work. The jokes that seemed thrown off and random were usually the product of long discussions and multiple rewrites. The character moments that hit you somewhere unexpected were the result of writers who understood those characters deeply enough to find the genuine emotion underneath the comedy. That is what makes Family Guy Season 5 worth going back to and worth thinking about seriously. Not just as a collection of funny moments, though it absolutely is that, but as the work of a group of genuinely talented people who were operating at the peak of their abilities and who produced something that has stayed in the cultural conversation for almost 2 decades since it first aired. The next time you sit down to watch one of these episodes, I want you to keep some of these facts in your head. Notice the sound design. Pay attention to how the musical moments are constructed. Think about the balance between the shock comedy and the genuine character work. Hey, you are going to see this season completely differently, and honestly, that feels like exactly the right reward for going down this particular rabbit hole together. If you made it to the end of this, first of all, thank you, because this was a deep one. If you are a Family Guy fan who has been waiting for someone to take this show seriously enough to actually dig into what makes it work, I hope this delivered for you. Drop in the comments what your favorite Season 5 episode is, because I want to know. And I have very strong opinions about this that I will absolutely argue with you about. Make sure you subscribe, because we do this kind of thing regularly, and there is a lot more to come. Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Alex, and we do deep dives into the shows, movies, and pop culture moments that defined our childhoods and honestly, still define us today. And look, I know what you are thinking. You have seen 100 Family Guy videos, you have seen the clip compilations, you have seen the top 10 lists, you have seen the reaction videos. But I promise you, what we are doing today is something different. We are going in. We are going deep. We are talking about one of the most underrated and genuinely fascinating seasons in the entire run of the show. And I am talking about Season 4 of Family Guy. Now buckle up, because some of these facts are going to completely change how you watch these episodes. Before we get into it, I need to ask you something. How many of you actually know that Season 4 almost did not happen the way we know it? Because the whole context around this season is wild, and we are going to get into all of that. Stick around, because I have saved the absolute craziest facts for the end of this video, and trust me, you do not want to miss them. Drop a comment right now if you are a Family Guy fan. I want to know your favorite season, because that debate is always fire in the comments section. All right, let us set the stage. Family Guy had been canceled by Fox. The show was done. It was over. They pulled the plug after Season 3, and for a while it genuinely seemed like the Griffin family was just going to fade into television history. But then something incredible happened, and this is really where Season 4 gets its entire identity from. Adult Swim picked up the reruns, started airing the old episodes, and the ratings were absolutely through the roof. People were watching in massive numbers. DVD sales went crazy. and Fox executives suddenly realized they had made a potentially massive mistake. The show was brought back, and Season 4 premiered in 2005, making Family Guy one of the very few animated shows in television history to get canceled and then successfully return. That context is everything when you are watching Season 4 because you can feel in the writing that the creators were energized, they were hungry, and they had something to prove. The whole season has this electricity to it that you can really sense if you pay attention. Now here is the first fact that I think is genuinely mind-blowing if you are a real fan of the show. The episode Stewie Loves Lois, which opened the 4th season, was not just a fun episode about Stewie developing an unusual attachment to his mother. It was also a very deliberate creative statement. Seth MacFarlane and the writers wanted to show audiences that the show had evolved during its time off the air. The dynamic between Stewie and Lois in the earlier seasons was almost entirely defined by Stewie wanting to kill her. That was basically the whole joke for a long time. But in Season 4, they started exploring something more layered and, honestly, more interesting. Stewie is still chaotic and still absolutely unhinged in the best possible way. But there is this vulnerability introduced that makes him feel like a more complete character. The show used its comeback to intentionally deepen the characters rather than just doing the same thing that worked before. And that creative decision is honestly what separates great television from mediocre television. Let us talk about Peter Griffin for a second because Season 4 is arguably where Peter becomes the version of Peter that most people think of when they picture the character today. In the earlier seasons, Peter was definitely funny, but he was a bit more of a straightforward, bumbling dad archetype. By Season 4, the writers had really leaned into making Peter this force of nature, this unstoppable chaos engine, who somehow stumbles through life and always ends up more or less okay. There is a confidence in the writing around Peter in Season 4 that you can feel. The jokes land harder, the physical comedy is more committed, and the pop culture references feel more deliberately chosen rather than just thrown in. True, Peter Griffin in Season 4 is Peter Griffin at the height of his comedic power in a lot of ways. Okay, here's something that a lot of casual fans do not know. Season 4 is when the show really started leaning into what would become its signature style of cutaway humor in a much more structured and intentional way. Now the cutaway gag had been part of Family Guy from the beginning, but in Season 4, the writers started treating these cutaways almost like short films within the episode. Some of them are 30 seconds, some of them are a minute and a half, and the quality of the writing inside those cutaways got noticeably sharper. The writers' room reportedly had intense debates about which cutaways to include and which to cut, and a lot of material that was written for Season 4 never made it into the show. Think about all the incredible stuff that aired and then imagine there was even more that got left on the cutting room floor. That is both exciting and a little heartbreaking, honestly. Now I want to talk about the episode Don't Make Me Over because this one is fascinating from a production standpoint. This was the first new episode of Family Guy to air after the revival, not counting the season premiere in terms of fan reception, and it got enormous attention. The episode centers on Meg getting a makeover and becoming temporarily popular, which is a pretty classic sitcom premise. But Family Guy takes it in directions that a standard sitcom absolutely would not go. What is interesting is that the writers were very aware of how much scrutiny this episode was going to receive. They knew people were watching to see if the show still had it after being off the air for years, and they were essentially writing under a microscope. The fact that they delivered something genuinely funny and memorable under that kind of pressure says a lot about the strength of the team they had assembled. Let me hit you with a casting fact that is pretty wild. Season 4 is full of incredible guest appearances, and the show managed to pull in some seriously impressive names. The guest casting in this season was on another level, partly because the show's revival had generated so much buzz that celebrities were genuinely excited to be involved. Being on Family Guy had transformed from being a quirky niche thing into being a legitimate pop culture moment. Some of the guest voices in Season 4 include people who you would not necessarily expect to show up in an animated comedy, and the range of those appearances tells you a lot about how the show's reputation had shifted during its time away from television. Here is a fact about the writing process that I find absolutely fascinating. The Family Guy writer's room in Season 4 operated on a system where any writer could pitch any joke for any scene, regardless of whose episode it was. This is a collaborative approach that sounds chaotic, but apparently worked incredibly well for this show specifically. MacFarlane has talked about how the nature of Family Guy's humor, with its rapid-fire references and its willingness to go absolutely anywhere, required a room full of people who were all deeply knowledgeable about pop culture, film, television history, and just weird, obscure stuff in general. The writers were essentially competing with each other in the best possible way, trying to out-reference and out-funny each other. And the episodes that resulted from that environment have this density of jokes that rewards repeated viewing. You catch something new every time you watch a Season 4 episode, and that is not an accident. That is the direct result of 20 or 30 writers all bringing their absolute best material to every single episode. All right, let us talk about Petarded, which is one of the most controversial episodes in not just Season 4, but the entire run of the show. This is the episode where Peter discovers through a trivia game that he has a surprisingly low IQ, and the episode follows what happens when he legally qualifies for certain protections based on that discovery. The episode was polarizing when it aired, and honestly, it is still polarizing today. But what is interesting from a production standpoint is that the writers apparently debated this concept for a long time before committing to it. There were real concerns internally about whether the premise was going to land the way they wanted it to, and there were multiple rewrites before the final version. The episode that aired is actually significantly different from the original pitch. And the evolution of that episode through the writing process is a great example of how comedy writing is much more thoughtful and deliberate than it might appear on the surface. Now, here is something that connects to a bigger trend in Season 4 that I think is worth appreciating. The season has a surprisingly emotional undercurrent running through it that I do not think gets talked about enough. For all the chaos and the offensive jokes and the wild cutaways, Season 4 has some genuinely touching moments scattered throughout. The relationship between Brian and Stewie, which would eventually become one of the most beloved dynamics in the show's entire history, really starts developing its emotional depth in Season 4. You start to see glimpses of a genuine friendship forming between this alcoholic talking dog and this evil genius baby. And those glimpses are genuinely sweet in a way that sneaks up on you. Brian and Stewie in Season 4 are kind of like two outcasts who have found each other, and that is unexpectedly moving when you think about it. Let us get into some pure trivia now, because some of this stuff is just delightfully random. Season 4 features the debut of several characters and running gags that would become absolutely central to the show's identity going forward. The season was essentially building a mythology in real time, adding layers to the world of Quahog that would pay off in later seasons. The writers were planting seeds in Season 4 without necessarily knowing which ones would grow into full storylines, which is actually a pretty common approach in long-running television but feels especially apparent in this particular season when you watch it with fresh eyes. The animation in Season 4 is also worth talking about because it represents a genuine leap forward from the earlier episodes. During the years the show was off the air, animation technology had continued advancing, and when Family Guy came back, it came back looking noticeably crisper and more polished. The character movements are smoother, the backgrounds are more detailed, and the action sequences, particularly the ones involving Stewie's weapons and gadgets, have a more cinematic quality to them. The show had a bigger budget in Season 4, partly because Fox was very motivated to make the revival a success, and that money shows on screen in ways that maybe viewers did not consciously notice, but definitely felt on some level. Here is a behind-the-scenes fact that I genuinely love. Seth MacFarlane reportedly watched an enormous number of classic Hollywood films and old television shows during the years Family Guy was off the air, and a lot of that material found its way into Season 4 in the form of references and parodies. MacFarlane's love of classic entertainment, particularly the golden age of Hollywood musicals and variety shows, has always been a part of his creative DNA, but it feels especially present in Season 4. There are moments in this season where the show essentially becomes a loving tribute to entertainment styles that most of its audience had never experienced firsthand, and MacFarlane was essentially introducing those styles to a whole generation through the filter of a completely insane animated comedy. That is actually kind of a beautiful thing when you think about it. Now let us talk about one of the most famous episodes from this season, which is the episode titled The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. For people who may not remember, this episode deals with Cleveland discovering that his wife Loretta has been having an affair with Quagmire, and it is one of the more dramatically intense episodes in the show's history up to that point. What is fascinating about this episode is how the writers managed to play it mostly straight emotionally while still delivering on the comedy that audiences expected. Cleveland's reaction to the betrayal feels genuinely painful, in a way that sitcom storytelling often avoids because it is uncomfortable. But Family Guy leaned into it. This episode led directly to the spin-off Cleveland show several years later. So in a very real sense, this Season 4 episode planted the seed for an entirely separate television show. That is a pretty remarkable legacy for a single episode to carry. Let me tell you something about the music in Season 4 that I think deserves way more attention. Family Guy has always been a show that uses music brilliantly, and Season 4 is arguably where that musicality reached its peak during this era of the show. The original songs written for Season 4 episodes are genuinely clever pieces of comedy writing in their own right. Writing a funny song that also moves a plot forward and also reveals character is an incredibly difficult creative task, and the show made it look effortless in this season. Some of the musical moments from Season 4 have taken on lives of their own outside the show and are still referenced and shared by fans today, which tells you something about how they were crafted. Good comedy music is actually hard to write, and the team behind Family Guy Season 4 was really firing on all cylinders in this department. Okay, here is a fact that connects to the broader television landscape of 2005 and 2006. Season 4 was airing at a time when animated adult comedies were having a real moment. The Simpsons was still going strong, South Park was entering what many consider its creative peak, and Futurama was also making noise. Family Guy's revival dropped right into the middle of this environment and had to establish itself as something distinct. The writers were very aware of the competition and very aware that critics were ready to write the show off as derivative or shock-driven. Season 4 is in many ways a direct response to those criticisms, a season that is saying, look at how much we can do. Look at how many different emotional registers we can hit. So, look at how ambitious this storytelling actually is underneath all the chaos. Whether or not it fully succeeded in changing critical opinion is debatable, but the ambition is real, and you can feel it throughout the season. Here is something I want to get into about Quagmire's character in Season 4. Because his arc across this season is really interesting. Glenn Quagmire is one of those characters who could easily be one-dimensional, and in earlier seasons he sometimes was. But Season 4 starts giving him more complexity, and you can see the writers figuring out that Quagmire is actually more interesting when he has genuine emotional responses to things, rather than just being the punchline to every inappropriate joke. The Cleveland Loretta episode is the most obvious example of this. But there are smaller moments scattered through Season 4 where Quagmire shows genuine humanity, and those moments make the character more compelling overall. It is the difference between a character being funny and a character being someone you actually care about, and Season 4 starts walking that line with Quagmire in a way the show had not really done before. Let me pivot to talking about Meg in Season 4, because I think Meg's treatment in this season is worth examining closely. Meg Griffin is one of the most interesting characters in Family Guy from a writing perspective because she exists as a lightning rod for the show's darker comedic impulses. The running joke about the family treating Meg poorly reaches new heights in Season 4, and the writers were clearly having a lot of fun with how far they could push this premise. But what is interesting is that Season 4 also gives Meg moments of genuine pathos and relatability. She is not just a punching bag in this season. She is also occasionally the most normal person in a family full of absolute lunatics, and the show acknowledges that in ways that are actually kind of sympathetic toward her. Now here is a production fact that blew my mind when I first learned about it. The average Family Guy episode, including in Season 4, takes somewhere between 8 and 10 months to produce from the initial writing stage to the final delivered episode. When you watch a 22-minute episode of Family Guy and laugh at a joke that seems effortless, that joke has been through multiple rounds of script notes, recording sessions, animatic reviews, animation production, post-production sound, and final quality checks. The spontaneity and looseness that makes Family Guy funny is entirely manufactured through a very long and very detailed process. The jokes that feel like they were just thrown in randomly are often the product of weeks of debate and refinement. That knowledge does not make the show less funny, but it gives you a deep appreciation for the craft involved. All right, I promised you some truly wild facts, and here we go. There is an episode in Season 4 called Jungle Love, where Peter ends up taking Chris to what is supposed to be a music festival, but things go completely sideways in the most Family Guy way possible. The episode features some musical performances that were genuinely ambitious for an animated show to pull off, and the production team had to solve some real technical and creative challenges to make those sequences work the way they did. The episode also has a subplot that was almost cut entirely in a late-stage revision but ended up being kept in after test screenings showed that audiences responded really strongly to it. What stays and what gets cut in television production is often less about quality and more about timing and instinct, and the fact that this subplot nearly disappeared is a good reminder of how much great television nearly does not exist. Here is something about Seth MacFarlane himself in Season 4 that I think is fascinating. MacFarlane voices 4 of the main characters on the show, which is an absolutely staggering vocal performance commitment. Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire are all MacFarlane, and in Season 4, as the show was ramping back up, he was recording all of these characters while also running the show as creator and executive producer. The stamina and creative bandwidth required to do all of that simultaneously is almost hard to comprehend. And what is remarkable is that the characters never bleed into each other vocally. They are all completely distinct, and MacFarlane maintains those distinctions, episode after episode. The voice work in Season 4 is some of the best of the entire series run, and that is not something that happens automatically. That is years of craft and dedication paying off. Let us talk about the episode Blind Ambition because this one has a really interesting cultural dimension to it. The episode involves Peter trying to get on a reality show in a storyline that was clearly playing with the explosion of reality television that was happening in American culture at that exact moment. Season 4 aired right in the middle of the peak reality TV era, when shows about people competing for prizes or being filmed doing various things were absolutely everywhere, and Family Guy's commentary on that cultural moment is sharp and specific. The episode is funny on its own terms, but it is also a document of a particular moment in American pop culture history, and watching it now gives it an almost nostalgic quality that it did not have when it originally aired. Here is a fact about the international reception of Season 4 that I find genuinely interesting. Family Guy has always had a complicated relationship with different international markets, because the show's humor is so deeply rooted in American cultural references that it can be challenging to translate. Season 4, being one of the most reference-dense seasons in the show's history, faced some real challenges in international distribution. Some jokes simply do not translate, some references have no equivalent in other cultural contexts, and some of the comedy is built on assumptions about American institutions and experiences that audiences in other countries just do not share. The solutions that the international teams came up with varied wildly from market to market, and some of the translated or adapted versions of Season 4 episodes are genuinely fascinating objects in their own right. All right. We are heading toward the end of the season recap here, and I want to make sure we talk about what is arguably the most ambitious episode of Season 4, and possibly one of the most ambitious episodes in the show's entire history. Without getting too deep into spoilers for those of you who are planning to rewatch, there is a late Season 4 episode that essentially throws out the normal rules of how Family Guy episodes work and does something completely structurally different. The episode drew enormous attention when it aired and remains one of the most discussed episodes among serious fans of the show. What is remarkable about it is that the writers clearly knew they were taking a big swing, and the episode succeeds or fails for different viewers based entirely on whether they are willing to go on that particular ride. The fact that the show tried it at all, especially in a season where they were already under enormous pressure to justify the revival, says everything about the creative confidence of the team. One more thing I want to mention before we get to the really juicy final facts. Season 4 has an episode called Breaking Out is Hard to Do, where Lois gets addicted to shoplifting, and this episode is a masterclass in how to escalate a comedy premise. The episode starts with a relatively grounded situation, Lois shoplifting something small on a whim, and then keeps building and building until it reaches a conclusion that is absolutely insane, but feels completely logical given everything that came before it. This kind of escalation structure is actually really hard to write well, and a lot of comedy shows fall apart in the escalation because they either go too far too fast or they do not commit hard enough at the end. Family Guy Season 4 figures out the pacing of escalation in this episode in a way that feels textbook perfect. And it is honestly worth studying if you are interested in comedy writing as a craft. Here is the fact I have been building toward this entire video, the one that I think really puts Season 4 in its proper context. When you look at the history of television revivals, shows that got canceled and came back, the track record is genuinely not great. Most shows that come back after cancellation either try too hard to recapture what made them popular the first time and end up feeling stale, or they try to reinvent themselves too dramatically and lose what made them special. Season 4 of Family Guy somehow managed to do neither of those things. It came back feeling both familiar and evolved, both nostalgic and forward-looking, both true to what the show had always been and genuinely new. That balance is almost impossibly hard to strike, and the fact that Family Guy hit it on the very first season back is remarkable. It is the main reason Season 4 holds such a special place in the hearts of fans who were there for the original run and then experienced the revival. Season 4 also directly demonstrated to the television industry that audience loyalty can survive cancellation, that home video and syndication can build or rebuild an audience, and that networks should pay closer attention to data about what audiences are actually watching rather than just relying on traditional ratings metrics. The return of Family Guy changed how television executives thought about canceled shows, and the ripple effects of that have been felt throughout the industry ever since. Every show that has ever been saved by fan campaigns, by streaming data, by DVD sales figures, every one of those stories exists in the shadow of what Family Guy Season 4 proved was possible. The writers knew all of this context when they were making Season 4. They knew they were writing something that was historically significant in addition to being a comedy show, and that awareness pushed them to be better. It pushed them to take risks they might not have taken in a normal season, to go for the big swings, to try the ambitious ideas, to not play it safe. And the result is a season of television that is funny and chaotic and weird, and sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally surprisingly moving and absolutely worth watching or rewatching today. So there you have it. Random facts about Family Guy Season 4 that hopefully gave you a new appreciation for what that season was, what it meant, and why it still matters. I want to know in the comments which fact surprised you the most. Was it the production timeline? Was it the behind-the-scenes stuff about the writer's room? Was it the stuff about how the revival changed the television industry? Drop it down below. I read every single comment. And if you want more content like this, we do deep dives on animated shows, live-action classics, films, all of it. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and share it with a fellow Family Guy fan who needs to see it. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and as always, stay curious. What if I told you that one of the most beloved animated seasons in television history almost never existed at all? We are talking about Family Guy Season 3, a collection of episodes that helped define adult animation forever. And today, we are diving into the wildest, most surprising, and genuinely fascinating facts about that iconic run that most fans have absolutely no idea about. Stick around, because some of these are going to completely change the way you watch the show. I promise you that by the end of this video, your brain is going to be full of trivia that will make you the most dangerous person at any Family Guy fan gathering. Let us get into it. So before we even touch the first fact, let us set the scene. Season 3 of Family Guy aired back in 2001, and it came at a time when the show was fighting for its life. The ratings were inconsistent, the network had complicated feelings about the content, and nobody really knew if Family Guy was going to stick around long enough to matter. And yet, Season 3 ended up being this incredible creative explosion, where the writers were clearly pushing every single boundary they could find. The results were some of the most memorable moments in cartoon history. But here is what makes Season 3 extra special. And this is something most people gloss over. This was the last season before Fox canceled the show the first time. So, every episode in Season 3 carries this almost unintentional weight of finality, even though the creators had no idea at the time that the curtain was about to fall. That context changes everything when you go back and rewatch those episodes. Now let us talk about the episode that opened Season 3 and the chaos surrounding it. The season kicked off, and immediately the show was doing things that other animated programs simply were not doing. The writing staff during this period included some incredibly talented people who were willing to take massive creative swings. And Season 3 is where you can really feel that fearlessness radiating from the screen. The cutaway gags were getting sharper, the character dynamics were getting more defined, and Peter Griffin was evolving from a somewhat generic bumbling dad into this specific, bizarre, deeply funny character that audiences were falling in love with. That transformation happened largely in Season 3, and it is worth appreciating just how deliberate that was. Here is a fact that blows people's minds when they first hear it. The Quagmire character, who we all know and either love or have complicated feelings about, underwent significant development during Season 3. The writers were actively figuring out exactly what made Quagmire funny versus what made him just uncomfortable. And that calibration process produced some of the funniest Quagmire moments in the entire run of the series. What is fascinating is that the voice performance by Mike Henry, combined with the writing choices, created this almost cartoon physics version of a problematic character that audiences somehow found hilarious rather than off-putting. The Season 3 writing staff deserves enormous credit for threading that needle, and it was far from accidental. Let us talk about Stewie Griffin for a moment, because Season 3 is absolutely crucial to understanding how this character became the fan favorite that he is today. In the earlier seasons, Stewie was primarily coded as this theatrical villain baby with world domination plans, and a strange obsession with eliminating his mother. That core was always there. But Season 3 started introducing these little moments of vulnerability and absurdity that made Stewie feel more like a complete character rather than just a one-note gag. The writers began experimenting with what happened when you put Stewie in scenarios that had nothing to do with his evil plans, and the results were some of the most quoted lines and moments the show has ever produced. The evolution of Stewie Griffin as a comedic character is one of the great stories of Season 3. And most fans do not fully appreciate how much of that transformation happened during this specific run of episodes. Now here is something genuinely interesting from a production standpoint. The animation during Season 3 had some notable quirks and inconsistencies. And this was not laziness or carelessness. The production pipeline for animated television in the early 2000s was genuinely complicated, and Family Guy was working with international animation studios to bring the episodes to life. This meant that the creative vision articulated in the storyboards and scripts sometimes came back looking slightly different than intended. What is remarkable is that some of those happy accidents actually became beloved character animation moments. There are specific scenes in Season 3 where the animation does something unexpected, and it actually makes the joke funnier rather than undermining it. That kind of serendipity is part of what gives animated shows from this era their particular charm. Let us jump to one of the most famous episodes from Season 3, which is the Road to Rhode Island episode, and I want to share some context that most casual fans have never heard. This episode was groundbreaking in ways that the fan community sometimes underestimates. It established the road to format that would become one of Family Guy's most beloved recurring structures throughout the entire series. The decision to send Stewie and Brian on an adventure together was not obviously correct at the time. These were two characters who existed in very different comedic registers, one being a sophisticated intellectual dog, and the other being a murderous infant genius. And combining them required real creative confidence. The chemistry that emerged from that pairing became one of the most valuable creative assets the show has ever had. The music in Road to Rhode Island deserves its own discussion because this is where Family Guy really committed to the idea that it could be a genuine musical comedy. Seth MacFarlane's vocal abilities were deployed in a way that demonstrated this was not just a novelty. It was a legitimate artistic strength. The songs in that episode hold up in a way that most television songs from 2001 simply do not. There is a craftsmanship to those musical moments that reflects the genuine passion the creative team had for classic Hollywood musical traditions. MacFarlane grew up loving that era of entertainment, and Season 3 is where that love started flowing most freely into the actual content of the show. Okay, here is a fact that is going to make you look at the show differently. The writing room for Season 3 was producing scripts at an absolutely brutal pace, and the pressure on the writers was immense. Television animation has notoriously punishing schedules because you have to write the scripts far enough in advance to allow for the entire production pipeline to function, which means writers are sometimes working a year or more ahead of when an episode will actually air. This creates an interesting creative pressure cooker situation where the writers are making jokes and cultural references without always knowing exactly when or whether those references will land with audiences. Some of the most confident comedic swings in Season 3 were written by people who had no guarantee the show would even still be on the air when those episodes finally broadcast. Brian Griffin is another character whose Season 3 development deserves serious attention. The show was really starting to lean into the tension between Brian's self-image as a sophisticated intellectual and the reality of his often embarrassing and ordinary dog behaviors and desires. That gap between aspiration and reality is genuinely one of the richest comedic veins in the entire series, and Season 3 is where the writers started mining it most deliberately. The jokes about Brian's novel, his drinking, his failed romantic relationships, these all started crystallizing in Season 3 into the fully formed comedic portrait that audiences would spend the next 2 decades loving and laughing at. Here is something that speaks to the cultural impact of Season 3 specifically. Many of the episodes from this season ended up being the ones that lived on in pop culture memory long after the show itself was temporarily canceled. When Family Guy came back from the dead in 2005 thanks to DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, a lot of the content that had converted casual viewers into passionate fans was from Season 3. People would buy the DVD sets and discover episodes they had never seen, and the Season 3 episodes were disproportionately represented among the ones that made people fall in love with the show all over again. That resurrection story is one of the most remarkable in television history, and Season 3 is a central chapter of it. Now, let us talk about Meg Griffin because this is actually a complicated and interesting story. Season 3 began more firmly establishing Meg as the family punching bag, and while that is not a particularly flattering role, the way the writers handled it during this season was actually more nuanced than it gets credit for. Meg had genuine comedic moments in Season 3 that went beyond just being the butt of jokes. And there were episodes where her perspective was treated with something approaching empathy. The full descent of Meg into pure punching bag territory happened later in the series. In Season 3, there was still some genuine attempt to give her a character beyond that function, and watching those episodes now you can see the writers wrestling with what they wanted to do with this character. Let us talk about the Cleveland character for a moment because Season 3 contains some excellent Cleveland moments that rarely get discussed. Cleveland Brown as a character was always operating as this calm, measured counterpoint to Peter's chaos, and the comedy of that contrast was working really well during Season 3. The specific dynamic between Cleveland and Peter during this period of the show has a warmth to it that later seasons sometimes lost. And if you go back and watch the Season 3 episodes specifically looking at how Cleveland and Peter interact, you notice these small character moments that are genuinely lovely in addition to being funny. Here is a production fact that most fans would find genuinely surprising. The voice recording sessions for Family Guy happen before the animation is produced, which means the animators are working from the actors' vocal performances to create the visuals rather than the other way around. This process means that the comedic timing you hear in the finished episodes is entirely dependent on the actors nailing their deliveries in the recording booth without the context of seeing the finished animation. For Season 3, which contains some extremely precise comedic timing in its cutaway gags and dialogue exchanges. This means the cast was essentially performing these jokes somewhat blind and trusting that the finished product would land correctly. The fact that so many of those moments work perfectly is a testament to the skill of that voice cast. Let us get into something that Season 3 does that I think is genuinely underappreciated in discussions about the show's creative legacy. Season 3 represents maybe the purest version of what Family Guy was actually trying to be before network pressure and demographic targeting started influencing the creative direction in more visible ways. There is an anarchic quality to some of the Season 3 storytelling that feels almost experimental by the standards of primetime animation at the time. Episodes would take structural detours that had no narrative justification beyond the fact that they were funny, and the confidence required to do that on a major network primetime show in 2001 was actually quite remarkable. Now, something really fascinating about Season 3 from an animation history perspective. The cutaway gag format, which Family Guy essentially popularized and which has since been copied and adapted by countless other animated shows and even some live-action productions, was really hitting its creative peak during Season 3. The ratio of setup to payoff in those cutaways was dialed in to an almost scientific degree by this point in the show's run. Earlier seasons had cutaways that sometimes went on too long or did not quite justify the interruption to the main story. By Season 3, the writers had figured out the exact length and style that made those interruptions feel like rewards rather than distractions. That formula is now so familiar it almost feels inevitable, but someone had to figure it out, and it happened largely in Season 3. Here is something that connects Season 3 to the broader culture of the early 2000s in interesting ways. The references and satirical targets in Season 3 reflect a very specific moment in American pop culture and politics, and revisiting those episodes now gives them this unexpected quality as time capsules. You are watching jokes about things that were current events in 2001, filtered through the sensibility of writers who were themselves products of a particular generation and cultural background. Some of those references land differently today than they did at the time, and in some cases they have actually gained new meaning that the writers could not have anticipated. That time capsule quality is one of the unexpected pleasures of re-watching Season 3 with fresh eyes. Let us talk about one of the more technically impressive things Season 3 accomplished, which is the escalation of the show's musical ambition. Beyond Road to Rhode Island, Season 3 had multiple episodes where original songs played significant roles, and the level of craft in those compositions was higher than most people realize. Writing a song that works as a joke is genuinely difficult because the music has to function well enough that it does not distract from the comedic content, but the comedic content has to be strong enough that it does not need the music as a crutch. The Season 3 team was threading that needle with impressive consistency, and it laid the groundwork for the increasingly ambitious musical moments that Family Guy would deliver in later seasons. Okay, here is a fact about Season 3 that touches on something almost philosophical about animated television. One of the persistent debates in the Family Guy fan community is about which era of the show represents its creative peak. A significant portion of serious fans will argue that Season 3 is where the show was firing on all cylinders before it became too aware of its own reputation and started playing to the crowd in less interesting ways. There is a freshness to Season 3, a sense that the creators were still surprising themselves with what the show could do, that makes it feel qualitatively different from even some excellent later seasons. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, the argument is worth taking seriously. Let us discuss the episode Death Lives, which is one of the more emotionally interesting pieces of content in Season 3, and one that does not always get the recognition it deserves. This episode took the show in a more sentimental direction without completely abandoning its comedic identity, and that balance is actually quite hard to achieve. The Peter and Lois relationship is treated with genuine affection in this episode, and the show demonstrates that underneath all the chaos and absurdity, there was a real marriage at the center of the story with actual emotional stakes. That emotional foundation is part of what separated Family Guy from pure nihilistic animation. And Season 3 episodes like this one are where that foundation was most clearly visible. Here is something about the cultural footprint of Season 3 that speaks to how influential this period of the show was. If you look at the development of adult animation throughout the 2000s and 2010s, shows that came later were clearly processing what Family Guy Season 3 had done. The combination of pop culture satire, cutaway humor, musical comedy, and character-based emotional storytelling that Season 3 exemplified became almost a template that other shows were either following or explicitly reacting against. The influence is not always acknowledged, but it is absolutely present, and Season 3 is the purest expression of that template. Now let us get into something that fans of the show who pay close attention to continuity always find interesting about Season 3. This season has some notable continuity quirks that are partly a product of the era in which it was made. Animated shows in the early 2000s were not the serialized continuity-conscious productions that many of them are today. Each episode was largely designed to stand alone, which meant that character details and even some plot elements could shift between episodes without any official acknowledgement. Season 3 has some of these moments, and rather than being flaws, they are actually interesting artifacts of a storytelling philosophy that prioritized each individual episode being as funny as possible over maintaining a rigid internal canon. Let us talk about the role of Peter Griffin's job at the brewery during Season 3 because this is one of those elements that grounded the show in a specific social and economic reality that gave the humor weight. The Pawtucket Brewery setting allowed the writers to do class and workplace comedy alongside the domestic and pop culture material, and Season 3 made good use of that setting. The relationship between Peter and his boss, Mr. Pewterschmidt's world, versus the working-class Quahog neighborhood where the Griffins lived, was a genuine thematic underpinning of the show during this era, even if that thematic richness was never something the show advertised or made explicit. Here is something about the Season 3 premiere that most fans have never specifically thought about. The way a season premiere functions for an animated show is somewhat different from how it works for a live-action show, because animated shows do not have the visual shock of a cast returning after a hiatus or the dramatic revelation of new settings and costumes. An animated show has to establish that a new season is beginning entirely through the quality and tone of its storytelling. Season 3 did this effectively, and there is a confidence in the early episodes of the season that signals the creative team felt they had figured something important out about how the show worked. Let us get into the villain energy of Season 3 for a moment because this is genuinely fun to think about. The show during this period had a real appetite for creating characters who operated as antagonists within individual episodes. And the variety and creativity of those antagonistic figures was genuinely impressive. From petty social rivalries to larger absurdist conflicts, Season 3 gave us a gallery of minor antagonists that served as perfect foils for the Griffin family's particular brand of chaos. That villain variety kept episodes feeling fresh, even when the show was working within its established comedic formulas. Now, here is a fact that really puts Season 3 in interesting historical context. When these episodes were originally airing, the DVR did not yet exist as a widespread technology. Most viewers were watching Family Guy live, which means the audience experience was fundamentally different from how modern viewers discover and consume the show. There was no pausing, rewinding, or replaying that perfect joke delivery. Viewers had one shot to catch everything happening on screen, and the writers were essentially designing jokes for an audience that was going to experience each moment exactly once in real time. That design constraint produced a style of comedy that is actually quite sophisticated in how it layers visual and verbal gags, so that even if you miss one element, another is there to land. Let us talk about something that the animators working on Season 3 deserves recognition for, which is the visual character acting that made the humor land beyond just the writing and voice performances. There are moments throughout Season 3 where the character animation does something unexpected with an expression or a physical movement that elevates a joke from funny to hilarious. The timing of a held expression, the specific way a character's eyes move before a punchline lands, These are decisions made by animators that do not get enough credit in conversations about why Family Guy worked so well during this period. Season 3 is full of excellent character animation choices that reward close attention. Here is a fact about Seth MacFarlane's creative vision during Season 3 that provides useful context. MacFarlane was remarkably young when he was running this show, and the ambition and confidence reflected in Season 3 is all the more impressive when you consider that context. He was synthesizing influences from classic Hollywood, old-school television comedy, musical theater, and contemporary satire into something that felt genuinely original, and he was doing it at an age when most people are still figuring out their creative identities. Season 3 represents MacFarlane's creative voice in something close to its purest early form, and before the show became such a massive cultural institution that it inevitably started influencing itself. Let us address the Lois Griffin factor in Season 3 because this character is sometimes overlooked in discussions about what made this season great. Lois during Season 3 was depicted as genuinely capable and often the smartest person in any given situation, while also having her own blind spots and comedic vulnerabilities. That balance made her an effective comedic character in a way that she sometimes was not in later seasons when the show started using her more narrowly. Season 3. Lois had agency and dimension, and that enriched every episode she was central to, which was most of them. Now, something genuinely wild about how Season 3 ended up being received versus how it was received at the time. Contemporary reviews of Season 3 Family Guy were decidedly mixed. The critics at the time had not yet figured out how to evaluate what Family Guy was doing, partly because the show was operating at a frequency that was somewhat alien to the critical frameworks that existed for animated television. The standard was set largely by The Simpsons, which was a very different animal, and critics who applied Simpsons criteria to Family Guy often found it wanting in exactly the ways that its actual fans found it most thrilling. The rehabilitation of Season 3's critical reputation happened retroactively, as the show's cultural influence became undeniable. Here is something about the Season 3 guest voices that is worth knowing. Animated shows rely on their guest voice performances in interesting ways because, unlike live-action guest appearances, animated guests are present only through their voices. The guest voices in Season 3 were used with real creativity, and in several cases the casting choices for guest roles demonstrated an awareness of comedy history and entertainment culture that added layers to the humor for viewers who got the references. Those choices reflected the genuine depth of entertainment knowledge in the Family Guy writing room during this period. Let us talk about the ending of Season 3 and what it meant in the context of the show's history. The season ended without any fanfare or acknowledgement that it might be the last batch of new Family Guy episodes for years. There was no dramatic finale, no attempt to wrap up story threads in a way that would provide closure if the show did not return. It just ended the way every other episode ended, with the Griffins in their house in Quahog, and then the show was gone. That quiet ending makes Season 3 feel even more interesting in retrospect, because there is something bittersweet about watching those final episodes of the original run, knowing what was coming. The show was about to disappear, and nobody involved knew that the story was going to eventually come back with one of the most remarkable second acts in television history. The legacy of Season 3 is genuinely hard to overstate. When Family Guy returned in 2005, and the creative team was returning to a set of characters and a comedic voice that had been defined and refined through 3 seasons, and Season 3 was the most fully realized expression of that original voice. The new episodes had to recapture what those original seasons had done while also moving forward, and understanding Season 3 is essential to understanding both how successful and how complicated that creative challenge was. Season 3 was the finishing point of the original Family Guy, and everything that came after existed in dialogue with what those episodes had established. Let us close with something that really captures why Season 3 matters beyond the facts and trivia we have covered. Family Guy at its best is a show that is simultaneously stupid and sophisticated, mean and warm, cynical and sentimental. Those contradictions are not accidental. and they are not awkward compromises. They are the whole point. And Season 3 is where all of those contradictions were most perfectly balanced. The show had figured out how to be all of those things at once, without any of them undermining the others. And it would be years before it consistently managed that balance again. That is what makes Season 3 special, not just as a television artifact, but as a creative achievement worth studying and appreciating. So there you have it. A whole collection of random but genuinely fascinating facts about Family Guy Season 3 that should give you a much richer appreciation for what that season was doing and why it still matters. Whether you are a longtime fan who grew up with these episodes or a newer viewer discovering the show's history, Season 3 rewards the kind of attention we have been giving it today. If you enjoyed this video and want more deep dives into the history and behind-the-scenes details of shows like Family Guy, make sure you are subscribed because we have a ton more content like this coming. Drop a comment below telling me which Season 3 episode is your personal favorite, and let me know if there are any specific Family Guy topics you want us to cover in future videos. See you in the next one. Have you ever wondered what happens when you dive deep into the twisted, chaotic universe of Family Guy while your brain is winding down for sleep? Tonight, we're going on a journey through the most bizarre, darkest, and surprisingly complex lore hidden beneath the surface of Seth MacFarlane's animated masterpiece. From alternate realities to character deaths that actually matter, from time travel paradoxes to the secret history of Quahog itself, this is going to be the most comprehensive exploration of Family Guy's hidden depths you've ever experienced. But before we begin our descent into this animated rabbit hole, let me warn you. What you're about to discover might change how you see those seemingly random cutaway gags forever. Because underneath all that crude humor and pop culture references lies a narrative so intricate and dark that it makes other animated series look like children's picture books. So get comfortable, dim those lights, and prepare to have your mind blown as we uncover the secret lore of Family Guy that most viewers never notice. Our story begins not with the Griffins we know today, but with a question that haunts every longtime viewer. How many times has this family actually died? The answer is more disturbing than you might think. Throughout the series, we've witnessed multiple universe resets, character resurrections, and timeline manipulations that suggest something far more sinister is happening in Quahog than meets the eye. Let's start with Brian Griffin, whose death in Season 12 wasn't just a ratings stunt. It revealed something crucial about the Family Guy universe. When Brian was killed by a car, the emotional weight of his death felt different from the usual cartoon violence we're accustomed to. But here's where it gets interesting. His replacement, Vinny, wasn't just a random character. He represented a glimpse into what the show could become without its moral compass, its voice of reason in a house full of chaos. The fact that Stewie was able to travel back in time to save Brian tells us something profound about the nature of time itself in this universe. Time travel isn't just a plot device in Family Guy. It's a fundamental force that shapes reality. Stewie's time machine isn't just some random invention. It's connected to a larger cosmic framework that governs how this universe operates. Consider this. Every time we see Stewie travel through time, reality doesn't just change, it fractures. We're shown multiple timelines existing simultaneously, each one revealing different aspects of the Griffin family's true nature. In some timelines, Peter never met Lois. In others, Meg is the favorite child. These aren't just alternate realities for comedy, they're glimpses into the infinite possibilities that exist when time itself becomes malleable. But time travel is just the beginning of Family Guy's cosmic horror. Let's talk about the multiverse theory that runs through the entire series. The show has explicitly confirmed that multiple universes exist, each with their own version of the Griffin family. We've seen evil versions, dog versions, even versions where the family members have completely different personalities and life paths. This multiverse concept becomes even more disturbing when you realize that some episodes might not be taking place in the same universe we started with. That feeling you get when character personalities seem inconsistent or when major events are forgotten. It might not be lazy writing. It might be because we're actually watching a different universe entirely. The chicken fights between Peter and Ernie represent something deeper than just extended fight sequences. They're battles between order and chaos, between different philosophical approaches to existence. Ernie represents structure, routine, and the mundane aspects of daily life. Peter represents pure unrestrained desire, and the rejection of social norms. Their fights aren't just physical confrontations, they're metaphysical battles for the soul of their shared reality. Each chicken fight escalates in scope and destruction, suggesting that these conflicts are affecting the fundamental fabric of their universe. The level of destruction they cause should realistically end civilization as we know it, yet everything returns to normal afterwards. This isn't cartoon logic. This is evidence of reality itself being reset after each confrontation, maintaining the status quo through cosmic intervention. Now let's examine the true nature of Stewie Griffin, perhaps the most complex character in the entire Family Guy universe. On the surface, he's a baby with advanced intelligence and homicidal tendencies. But dig deeper, and you'll find layers of psychological complexity that rival the greatest literary characters. Stewie's relationship with his sexuality isn't just character development. It represents the internal struggle between his intellectual advancement and his emotional immaturity. His confusion about his own identity reflects the broader theme of identity crisis that runs through the entire series. Every Griffin family member struggles with who they really are versus who they think they should be. His scientific inventions aren't just plot devices. They represent humanity's desire to control and manipulate reality itself. Stewie's time machine, his weather control device, his mind control technology, they're all attempts to impose order on a chaotic universe. But every time he uses these inventions, reality becomes more unstable, not less. The most disturbing aspect of Stewie's character is his relationship with Brian. Their friendship represents the only genuine emotional connection in the Griffin household, but it's also the most psychologically complex relationship in the series. Brian serves as both father figure and intellectual, equal to Stewie, creating a dynamic that's simultaneously heartwarming and deeply troubling. Let's shift our focus to Meg Griffin, the most tragic character in the Family Guy universe. Her treatment by her family isn't just running gag. It's a systematic psychological experiment in how prolonged emotional abuse shapes personality development. Meg represents the scapegoat, the family member who absorbs all the dysfunction and toxicity so that the others can maintain their illusion of normalcy. But here's what most viewers miss. Meg isn't actually the weakest member of the Griffin family. She's the strongest. She endures constant psychological torture and emerges with her sanity relatively intact. In episodes where she finally snaps and fights back, we see glimpses of her true potential. She's not the victim. She's the survivor. The episodes where Meg temporarily gains popularity or success reveal something crucial about the Griffin family dynamic. They literally cannot function without having someone to blame and abuse. When Meg rises above her assigned role, the entire family structure begins to collapse. This suggests that their dysfunction isn't accidental. It's carefully maintained through deliberate psychological manipulation. Chris Griffin represents wasted potential and the tragedy of inherited dysfunction. His artistic abilities and occasional flashes of intelligence show us what he could become in a healthier environment. But he's trapped in a cycle of learned helplessness, modeled after his father's behavior patterns. Chris is what happens when natural talent is systematically crushed by family dysfunction. His relationship with his imaginary friend and his artistic pursuits aren't just character quirks. They're survival mechanisms, ways of maintaining some connection to his authentic self while navigating a family that demands conformity to their twisted value system. Peter Griffin himself is perhaps the most disturbing character when you really analyze his behavior patterns. He isn't just immature or irresponsible. He displays clear signs of multiple personality disorders, sociopathic tendencies, and complete lack of empathy for others. His actions regularly destroy lives, yet he never faces meaningful consequences. This isn't cartoon logic. This is evidence that Peter exists outside normal social and legal frameworks. He's protected by something larger than himself, some cosmic force that ensures his continued existence regardless of the chaos he creates. Peter Griffin isn't just a bad father and husband. He's an agent of chaos, a force of nature that exists to disrupt order and stability. His job history reveals something interesting about the economic reality of the Family Guy universe. He's worked for toy companies, television networks, and various other industries, often rising to positions of significant power despite his obvious incompetence. This suggests that the economic system itself is fundamentally broken, rewarding chaos and incompetence over skill and dedication. Lois Griffin's psychology is perhaps the most complex of all: the family members. She comes from wealth and privilege but chose to marry into dysfunction. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was a deliberate choice that reveals something dark about her character. Lois is addicted to drama and chaos. She could leave Peter at any time, but she stays because the dysfunction feeds something deep within her psyche. Her moments of extreme violence and rage aren't just comedy beats. They're glimpses into her true nature, carefully hidden beneath a facade of suburban respectability. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin is potentially the most dangerous member of the family because she understands manipulation and control in ways the others don't. Her relationship with her wealthy family reveals the broader class dynamics at play in the Family Guy universe. The Pewterschmidts represent old money, established power structures, and systematic oppression disguised as respectability. Lois chose to reject that world, but she brought its values and methods into her marriage, creating a toxic hybrid of working-class dysfunction and upper-class manipulation. The town of Quahog itself is a character in this story, and its history reveals disturbing truths about American society. Founded on violence and maintained through systematic corruption, Quahog represents every small American town that's slowly dying while pretending everything is fine. The local government is openly corrupt, the police force is incompetent, and the social structures are designed to maintain inequality and dysfunction. Mayor West's obvious mental illness and continued political power isn't just absurd humor. It's commentary on how democratic systems can be manipulated by charismatic figures who appeal to voters' worst impulses. His policies are destructive and nonsensical, yet he remains popular because he validates the community's desire to avoid responsibility for their own problems. The recurring characters in Quahog each represent different aspects of American social dysfunction. Cleveland represents the loyal friend who enables destructive behavior rather than confronting it. Joe represents the warrior mentality that struggles to adapt to civilian life. Quagmire represents unchecked masculinity and sexual predation disguised as humor. But it's the relationship between these characters that reveals the true horror of the Family Guy universe. They're all trapped in cycles of mutual enablement, each one preventing the others from growing or changing. Their friendships aren't based on genuine affection or shared values. They're based on mutual need for validation of their worst impulses. The show's treatment of religion reveals another layer of its complex worldview. Religion in Family Guy isn't just mocked or dismissed. It's shown to be another system of control and manipulation, used by both believers and non-believers to justify their behavior and avoid taking responsibility for their actions. The various religious figures who appear throughout the series are almost universally corrupt, hypocritical, or mentally unstable. This isn't anti-religious sentiment. It's commentary on how spiritual concepts can be twisted to serve earthly power structures. The show suggests that genuine spirituality might exist, but it's constantly corrupted by human weakness and desire for control over others. Death himself appears as a recurring character, and his portrayal reveals something profound about the show's philosophy regarding mortality and meaning. Death isn't portrayed as evil or frightening. He's shown as tired, overworked, and occasionally compassionate. This suggests that mortality isn't the enemy in the Family Guy universe. Meaninglessness is the real enemy. The various celebrity encounters throughout the series serve a specific narrative function beyond simple humor. They represent the collision between fantasy and reality, between the Griffin family's delusional self-image and the actual impact they have on the world. Most celebrities in Family Guy are either destroyed by their encounter with the Griffins or reveal themselves to be just as dysfunctional and hollow. This pattern suggests that fame and success in their universe don't actually solve fundamental human problems. The celebrities are just as trapped in cycles of self-destruction and meaninglessness as the regular characters. Success becomes another form of prison, another way to avoid confronting deeper truths about existence and purpose. The show's handling of social and political issues reveals a deeply cynical worldview disguised as mindless entertainment. Every political position is shown to be equally corrupt and self-serving. Every social movement is revealed to have ulterior motives. Every attempt at progress is ultimately futile because human nature itself is fundamentally flawed. But here's where it gets interesting. This cynicism isn't presented as the final word. It's presented as the starting point for authentic human connection. Only after accepting the futility of external solutions do the characters occasionally find moments of genuine love, friendship, and meaning. These moments are rare and usually brief, but they represent the show's true message about what makes life worth living. The darker episodes of Family Guy, the ones that deal with serious topics like domestic violence, addiction, and mental illness, aren't just tonal experiments. They're glimpses into the reality that exists beneath the cartoon violence and crude humor. These episodes suggest that everything we've been laughing at is actually a coping mechanism, a way of dealing with trauma and pain that's too intense to face directly. Stewie and Brian's road trip episodes reveal this most clearly. When these two characters are alone together, away from the family dysfunction, their conversations become deeper and more meaningful. They discuss philosophy, mortality, and the nature of existence itself. These aren't just character development moments. They're the show's way of exploring serious themes without the distraction of constant humor. The time travel episodes create a complex mythology around cause and effect, free will, and determinism. When Stewie changes the past, the consequences ripple through reality in ways that suggest everything is connected to everything else. Small changes create massive alterations in the timeline, implying that individual choices have far more impact than we typically realize. But here's the disturbing part. Despite all the timeline changes and alternate realities, certain core patterns remain constant. The Griffin family dysfunction persists across multiple universes and timelines. This suggests that some aspects of human nature are so fundamental that they transcend individual choice and circumstance. The episodes that focus on Brian's writing career reveal the show's commentary on creative expression and artistic integrity. Brian's struggle to balance commercial success with authentic expression mirrors the show's own position in the entertainment landscape. Family Guy itself exists in the tension between meaningful content and commercial viability, between artistic expression and market demands. His relationship with other writers and artists in the series shows how creative communities can become toxic environments where competition and ego destroy the collaborative spirit that should drive artistic endeavors. The literary world in Family Guy is portrayed as pretentious, shallow, and ultimately meaningless. Yet Brian continues to pursue it because the alternative is accepting that his life has no greater purpose. The show's portrayal of education and intellectual development is particularly dark. Smart characters like Brian and Stewie are often shown to be more miserable than their less intelligent family members. Knowledge and awareness don't lead to happiness or fulfillment. They lead to greater understanding of how meaningless and chaotic existence really is. This anti-intellectual streak isn't promoting ignorance as bliss. It's questioning whether intelligence and education, as they currently exist in our society, actually serve human flourishing or just create new forms of suffering and alienation. The show suggests that wisdom might be different from intelligence, and that genuine understanding might require accepting mystery and uncertainty rather than seeking complete knowledge and control. The musical episodes and cutaway gags serve a specific psychological function beyond simple entertainment. They provide brief escapes from the relentless dysfunction of the main narrative. These moments of pure creativity and joy remind us what human beings are capable of when they're not trapped in cycles of self-destruction and mutual harm. But even these moments are tinged with sadness because they highlight how rare genuine happiness and creativity are in the Griffin family's daily life. The contrast makes their normal dysfunction seem even more tragic and unnecessary. As we reach the end of our deep dive into Family Guy's hidden lore, what emerges is a picture of a universe that's simultaneously hopeless and hopeful, meaningless and profound. The show presents human nature as fundamentally flawed and destructive, yet it also shows us moments of genuine love, creativity, and connection that make existence worthwhile despite its inherent tragedy. The Griffin family represents all of us at our worst and occasionally at our best. Their dysfunction is our dysfunction, magnified and exaggerated for comedic effect, but rooted in recognizable human weaknesses and fears. Their rare moments of genuine connection remind us that love and meaning are possible, even in the midst of chaos and pain. The true lore of Family Guy isn't hidden in elaborate conspiracy theories or complex mythologies. It's hidden in plain sight, in the psychological patterns and relationship dynamics that drive every episode. It's a show about damaged people trying to connect with each other and failing most of the time, but occasionally succeeding in ways that make all the failure worthwhile. And maybe that's the most profound truth of all. That meaning doesn't come from avoiding dysfunction and chaos, but from finding ways to love and connect, despite the inevitable presence of dysfunction and chaos in all human relationships. The Griffins aren't aspirational characters. They're cautionary tales and sources of recognition, mirrors that reflect our own struggles with identity, purpose, and connection. So the next time you watch Family Guy, remember that you're not just watching crude humor and pop culture references. You're watching one of the most complex examinations of human nature ever created, disguised as mindless entertainment, but actually offering profound insights into what it means to be human in a universe that often seems indifferent to our suffering and our joy. Sweet dreams, and may your own family dysfunction be slightly less chaotic than the Griffins, but no less full of unexpected moments of love and meaning that make it all worthwhile. The lore of Family Guy is ultimately the lore of being human, and that's a story that never really ends. It just keeps evolving with each new episode of our own lives. Have you ever wondered why Family Guy feels like a fever dream that somehow makes perfect sense? Tonight we're diving deep into the bizarre, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating lore of one of television's most chaotic animated families. From timeline inconsistencies that would make Doctor Who writers jealous to character deaths that stick about as well as wet spaghetti on a wall, we're exploring every twisted corner of the Griffin universe. So grab your favorite blanket, settle in, and prepare for a journey through 20-plus years of animated madness that will either put you to sleep or keep you up all night questioning everything you thought you knew about Quahog. Let's start with something that will immediately make your brain hurt in the most soothing way possible. The Griffin family timeline is more tangled than Christmas lights that have been stored in your attic for 3 years. Peter Griffin has somehow managed to work at a toy factory, a brewery, and about 17 other jobs while maintaining the same age and living in the same house. His children have been attending high school for over 2 decades, which either makes them the worst students in Rhode Island or suggests that time moves differently in their universe. Consider this mind-bending fact that perfectly captures the show's relationship with continuity. In early seasons, Chris Griffin was clearly established as being 14 years old. Fast forward through hundreds of episodes, multiple presidential elections, and several major world events, and Chris is still somehow 14. The same applies to Meg, who has been stuck in her teenage nightmare for so long that she could probably qualify for some kind of Guinness World Record for longest adolescence in television history. But here's where it gets even more deliciously confusing. The show occasionally references real-world events that have happened during its run, suggesting that some time has passed in their universe. Characters mention current technology, reference recent movies, and sometimes even acknowledge that things have changed. Yet the core family dynamics, ages, and circumstances remain frozen in this perfect amber of animated time, where nothing truly progresses, but everything constantly evolves. This temporal flexibility isn't a bug in Family Guy's programming. It's actually one of its most genius features. By refusing to be bound by traditional continuity, the writers have created a sandbox where literally anything can happen. Peter can die and come back to life. The family can move to different locations and then inexplicably return home. Characters can have completely different backstories from episode to episode, and somehow it all just works within the show's internal logic. Speaking of death, let's talk about the most famous resurrection in Family Guy history, which reads like a bizarre fairy tale designed specifically for adults who need to process the concept of impermanence in the safest possible way. Brian Griffin, the intellectual dog who serves as the family's voice of reason when he's not being a pretentious writer stereotype, was killed off in what seemed like a permanent way. The internet collectively lost its mind, fans organized protests, and for a brief moment, it looked like the show had actually committed to a major permanent change. But then, in true Family Guy fashion, they brought him back through time travel shenanigans that made about as much sense as you'd expect. The whole arc became this perfect metaphor for how the show treats consequence and permanence. Nothing is ever truly gone. Nothing is ever truly permanent. But the emotional impact of these fake deaths still somehow manages to hit viewers right in the feelings. It's like a magic trick where you can see exactly how it's done, but still feel amazed when the rabbit appears. This approach to character mortality extends throughout the entire show's history. Characters have died, been resurrected, killed again, and come back so many times that death in the Family Guy universe feels more like a temporary inconvenience than an actual ending. It creates this weirdly comforting atmosphere where you never have to worry about permanent loss, because in this world, everything can be undone with enough creativity and complete disregard for logical consistency. Now let's drift into the geographical mysteries of Quahog, Rhode Island, a town that exists in a space that defies both physics and geography in ways that should probably concern the local authorities. According to various episodes, Quahog is simultaneously a small, close-knit community where everyone knows each other and a sprawling metropolis with enough infrastructure to support major television stations, multiple hospitals, and apparently an infinite number of bars for Peter to get kicked out of. The town's layout changes depending on what the episode requires, which creates this dreamlike quality where familiar locations can suddenly be in completely different places or have entirely new neighbors. The Griffin house sometimes has a backyard that extends for miles and sometimes appears to be crammed between other houses with barely enough room for a garbage can. It's like living inside a memory where the details shift and change based on what feels most important at any given moment. This geographical flexibility extends to the show's treatment of distance and travel time. Characters can walk to locations that should be hours apart, drive to places that exist in different states entirely, or somehow end up in foreign countries through a series of increasingly implausible coincidences. It creates this sense that the world of Family Guy operates on dream logic, where emotional distance matters more than physical distance, and where you can end up anywhere if the story needs you there. The town itself has a personality that shifts and changes like a living entity. Sometimes Quahog is presented as a typical New England community with normal problems and reasonable people. Other times it's revealed to be home to the most bizarre collection of individuals ever assembled in one place, including but not limited to time travelers, aliens, talking animals, and people who seem to exist purely to serve as punchlines for increasingly elaborate jokes. Let's talk about the show's relationship with reality, which operates on multiple levels simultaneously in a way that would make philosophy professors weep with joy or frustration. Family Guy exists in a universe where talking babies, intellectually gifted dogs, and interdimensional travel are all perfectly normal and accepted parts of daily life. Yet somehow, the characters are constantly surprised by things that are far less remarkable than their everyday existence. Stewie Griffin, the family's infant mastermind, represents perhaps the most fascinating example of this reality-bending approach to storytelling. He's simultaneously a normal baby who requires diaper changes and feeding, and a genius inventor capable of creating time machines, death rays, and weather control devices. Other characters sometimes understand his advanced speech, and sometimes treat him like a normal baby, depending on what works best for the joke or story being told. This selective awareness extends throughout the entire cast and creates layers of reality that exist simultaneously without ever really contradicting each other. Brian is a dog who drives cars, drinks alcohol, and has complex romantic relationships with human women. Yet he also sometimes exhibits normal dog behaviors like chasing squirrels or getting excited about walks. The show never bothers to explain these contradictions because they don't need explanation in a universe where consistency is less important than entertainment value. The genius of this approach is that it mirrors how our own minds work when we're drifting off to sleep. In dreams, contradictory things can exist side by side without causing any distress. You can be simultaneously in your childhood home and your current apartment, talking to people who are both alive and dead, engaging in activities that make perfect sense within the dream context, but would be impossible in waking life. Family Guy captures this dream logic perfectly, creating a viewing experience that feels familiar and comforting even when it's completely absurd. Peter Griffin himself embodies this dream logic in human form. He's somehow managed to maintain steady employment despite being fired from multiple jobs, sometimes in the same episode. His incompetence is legendary, yet he consistently stumbles into situations where his particular brand of chaos somehow saves the day, or at least doesn't cause permanent damage to anyone who matters. He's like the universe's way of proving that sometimes being completely unprepared for everything is actually the best preparation for anything. His relationship with his family operates on this same dream logic frequency. He clearly loves his wife and children, but he also regularly forgets their names, ignores their needs, and puts them in danger through his various schemes and misadventures. Yet somehow, these contradictions never destroy the family unit because love in the Family Guy universe is more about intention than action, more about showing up than being competent. The show's treatment of flashbacks and cutaway gags creates another layer of reality that exists parallel to the main narrative without ever quite intersecting with it in ways that make traditional sense. These segments often contradict established character histories or present completely different versions of events that supposedly happened in the same timeline. Rather than being confusing, these contradictions become part of the show's charm, like listening to someone tell you about their dreams, where all the details keep shifting but the emotional core remains consistent. Let's explore the mysterious depths of the show's pop culture obsession, which functions like a massive shared unconscious where every reference, parody, and homage exists simultaneously across multiple decades of entertainment history. Family Guy doesn't just reference popular culture, it exists inside it like a fish swimming through an ocean of collective memory. The show treats the entire history of television, movies, music, and celebrity culture as one enormous playground where everything is equally accessible and equally fair game for reinterpretation. This creates a viewing experience that feels like browsing through a vast library of cultural memories, where you might encounter references to obscure 1970s television shows alongside parodies of current internet memes. The temporal mixing of references contributes to the show's dreamlike quality, where past and present blur together in ways that feel natural within the context of the viewing experience, but would make no sense if you tried to map them chronologically. The character interactions within this cultural soup create their own form of logic that operates independently of real-world consistency. Characters can discuss events from different time periods, as if they all happened yesterday, reference movies that wouldn't exist in their established timeline, and demonstrate knowledge of cultural phenomena that should be completely outside their experience. Yet somehow, these anachronisms never feel jarring because they're delivered with such confidence and integration into the story flow. This approach to cultural reference creates a kind of comfort food for the brain, where familiar elements from your entertainment consumption history get mixed together in new combinations that feel both surprising and inevitable. It's like having someone remix your favorite songs in ways you never expected, but that somehow work perfectly for the mood you didn't know you were in. The show's relationship with its own history creates another fascinating layer of complexity that rewards long-term viewers while remaining accessible to newcomers. Jokes and storylines sometimes reference events from episodes that aired years earlier, creating this sense of continuity within the chaos. Characters will occasionally mention things that happened in previous seasons as if they actually matter to the ongoing narrative, even though the show regularly contradicts its own established facts. This selective continuity operates like a friendship where you share inside jokes and references that have built up over years of interaction, but you don't expect every conversation to reference everything that has ever happened between you. Some things matter, some things don't, and the distinction between what's important and what's forgettable shifts based on context and emotional relevance, rather than chronological significance. Family Guy's approach to emotional storytelling creates waves of feeling that wash over viewers in patterns designed to keep you engaged without overwhelming you with too much intensity. The show regularly shifts between completely absurd comedy and surprisingly touching moments of family connection, often within the same episode or even the same scene. This emotional rhythm mirrors the natural fluctuations of consciousness as you transition from waking awareness to sleep. The touching moments often come from unexpected sources and catch viewers off guard in ways that feel authentic despite occurring within completely artificial contexts. A conversation between Peter and his children might reveal genuine insight into parenting challenges, even though it takes place during a storyline involving time-traveling robots or interdimensional portals. These moments of sincerity exist alongside the absurdity without diminishing either aspect of the experience. The show's treatment of family dynamics operates on multiple emotional frequencies simultaneously. The Griffin family clearly cares about each other deeply, but they also regularly treat each other terribly in ways that would destroy real relationships. Yet somehow, the underlying love and commitment always reasserts itself when it really matters, creating this sense that no matter how chaotic or dysfunctional things get, the core connections remain solid. This emotional safety net allows viewers to enjoy the chaos without worrying about permanent damage to characters they've grown to care about. It's like watching a family of professional stunt performers who can survive any explosion or catastrophe because you know they're wearing invisible protective gear made of animated resilience and narrative necessity. The character of Lois Griffin represents perhaps the most complex emotional anchor in the show's universe. She's simultaneously the voice of reason and a participant in the chaos, capable of being both the responsible adult who keeps the family functioning and the enabler who allows Peter's schemes to continue destroying everything around them. Her character embodies the show's approach to moral complexity, where people can be simultaneously good and bad, smart and foolish, loving and selfish, without these contradictions canceling each other out. Her relationship with her family creates emotional touchstones that ground the show's more surreal elements in recognizable human experiences. Her frustration with Peter's behavior, her concern for her children's well-being, and her own occasional lapses into questionable judgment all feel authentic, despite occurring within completely unrealistic scenarios. She becomes the emotional center around which all the chaos can orbit safely. The supporting characters in Quahog create a community ecosystem that feels both intimately familiar and completely unpredictable. Neighbors like Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland form a social network that somehow manages to remain stable despite regular exposure to Peter's reality-warping influence. Their friendship operates on the kind of dream logic where people can be simultaneously best friends and completely incompatible personalities, where loyalty and annoyance coexist without creating lasting conflict. These relationships mirror the kind of social connections that exist in small communities where people are stuck with each other regardless of whether they actually like each other. The result is a social dynamic where characters have learned to accept and work around each other's flaws rather than trying to change them, creating a sense of unconditional acceptance that's both touching and slightly disturbing. The show's approach to problem-solving reflects this same community dynamic, where issues are rarely resolved through traditional methods, but instead get worked around, ignored, or transformed into different problems that are somehow more manageable. Characters don't really grow and change in traditional narrative arcs, but they do develop coping strategies and adaptive behaviors that allow them to function within their chaotic environment. This creates a viewing experience that's surprisingly relaxing despite the constant chaos, because you learn to trust that somehow everything will work out in ways that might not make sense, but will feel satisfying within the show's internal logic. It's like being assured that no matter how complicated your dreams get, you'll always wake up in your own bed with all your problems exactly where you left them. The show's treatment of time and memory creates layers of nostalgia that operate simultaneously across multiple decades of cultural history. Episodes regularly feature flashbacks to different time periods that may or may not be consistent with previously established character histories, creating a sense that the past is fluid and changeable, rather than fixed and determined. This approach to history mirrors how memory actually works in human consciousness, where details shift and change based on current emotional needs rather than maintaining strict factual accuracy. Characters sometimes remember the same events differently in different episodes, and these conflicting memories are presented as equally valid, rather than evidence of inconsistent writing. This creates a universe where subjective experience matters more than objective truth, where what feels right is more important than what actually happened according to some external standard of accuracy. The result is a storytelling approach that feels surprisingly honest about how human memory and family mythology actually function. Families create shared stories about their history that serve emotional and social functions rather than documentary purposes. And these stories change over time to meet the evolving needs of the family system. Family Guy captures this dynamic perfectly by treating its own history as a living, breathing entity, rather than a fixed record of past events. As we reach the end of our journey through the wonderfully contradictory universe of Family Guy, it becomes clear that the show's greatest achievement might be its ability to create comfort through chaos, familiarity through absurdity, and relaxation through constant activity. The show operates like a perfect sleep aid for the modern mind, providing just enough stimulation to keep you engaged while maintaining just enough consistency to keep you feeling safe and secure. The lore of Family Guy isn't really about the specific details of character histories or plot continuities. Instead, it's about creating a universe where change and stability can coexist, where contradictions don't need resolution, and where the most important truth is that somehow everything always works out in the end, even when it doesn't make any logical sense. In a world where consistency and predictability often feel like distant memories, Family Guy offers the radical proposition that maybe coherence is overrated anyway. Maybe what we really need is a space where we can let go of our need for everything to make sense and just enjoy the ride, secure in the knowledge that no matter how weird things get, we're still fundamentally safe in this animated universe where love conquers all, even when love looks suspiciously like mutual tolerance for each other's most annoying qualities. So, as you drift off tonight, remember that somewhere in an animated Rhode Island, a family of lovable disasters continues their eternal cycle of chaos and reconciliation, proving night after night that sometimes the best stories are the ones that never really end. They just keep getting more interesting. Sweet dreams from Quahog, where nothing makes sense and everything works out exactly the way it should. Did you know that Family Guy has been secretly building one of the most complex and disturbing universes in television history? Tonight, we're diving deep into the hidden lore that connects every bizarre moment, every throwaway joke, and every seemingly random cutaway into something far more sinister than you ever imagined. Get comfortable, because what you're about to discover about the Griffin family and their world will completely change how you see this animated sitcom forever. Welcome to a journey through the darkest corners of Quahog, where nothing is quite what it seems, and every laugh might be masking something truly terrifying. I'm going to take you through the most mind-bending theories, hidden connections, and disturbing implications that have been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades. This isn't just about cartoon humor anymore. This is about a carefully constructed reality where time itself breaks down. where characters live and die and return without explanation, and where the very fabric of existence seems to bend to the whims of a family that might not even be human. Let's start with something that's been bothering fans for years. Have you ever noticed how characters in Family Guy seem to exist in multiple states of reality simultaneously? Peter Griffin has died countless times throughout the series, yet he continues to appear in subsequent episodes with no explanation. This isn't just cartoon logic at work. There's something much deeper happening here, something that suggests the Griffin family exists outside the normal rules of life and death. Consider this carefully. In one episode, Peter is literally crushed by a falling piano. In another, he's shot point blank in the chest. He's been decapitated, blown up, and killed in ways too numerous to count. Yet he always returns, usually within the same episode, sometimes carrying the memory of his death, sometimes acting as if nothing happened at all. This pattern extends to every member of the family, creating what theorists call the resurrection phenomenon. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The show has established that Peter remembers some of his deaths, but not others. In certain episodes, he makes direct references to previous fatal incidents, treating them as if they were merely inconvenient experiences rather than life-ending events. This suggests that the Griffin family exists in a state of quantum immortality, where their consciousness simply shifts to alternate timelines whenever they die in one reality. The implications of this are staggering. If the Griffins can't truly die, what does that make them? Are they some kind of interdimensional beings? Are they trapped in an endless cycle of death and rebirth? Or are they perhaps already dead, existing in some kind of purgatorial state where their worst impulses are allowed to manifest without permanent consequences? This theory gains even more weight when you examine the nature of their world. Quahog, Rhode Island, isn't just an ordinary small town. It's a place where the laws of physics bend and break on a daily basis. Characters regularly fall from impossible heights without injury, survive explosions that should level city blocks, and experience transformations that defy biological possibility. The town itself seems to reshape itself to accommodate whatever narrative demands the moment requires. Look at the Clam, the local bar where Peter spends most of his time. The interior layout changes from episode to episode, sometimes dramatically. Rooms appear and disappear, the building size fluctuates wildly, and the bar somehow manages to accommodate everything from small, intimate gatherings to massive concerts and events. This isn't just inconsistent animation. It's evidence that reality itself is malleable in Quahog. The same phenomenon affects the Griffin house. Rooms appear when needed and vanish when not required. The basement sometimes contains a simple laundry area. Other times, it's a vast underground complex with multiple levels and impossible architecture. The house has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that it's essentially become a ship of Theseus' paradox. At what point did the original Griffin home cease to exist and become something else entirely? But the most disturbing aspect of Family Guy lore involves the nature of time itself in this universe. The show has been running for over 20 years, yet the characters haven't aged. Stewie remains a baby, Meg is still a teenager, and Chris continues through high school perpetually. This isn't just a cartoon convention. The show has explicitly addressed the passage of time on multiple occasions, creating paradoxes that suggest something is fundamentally wrong with how time functions in their reality. Consider Stewie's advanced intelligence and technological capabilities. This isn't just a genius baby. Stewie has access to time travel technology, advanced weaponry, and scientific knowledge that surpasses anything available in our reality. He's built nuclear weapons in his bedroom, created sentient robots, and developed interdimensional travel devices. These aren't the inventions of a human child, no matter how intelligent. They're the creations of something far beyond human understanding. The time travel episodes reveal even more disturbing implications. When Stewie and Brian travel through time, they encounter multiple versions of themselves and their family members. Some of these versions are dramatically different, suggesting that the timeline they inhabit is just one of countless variations. In some timelines, the family members have different personalities, different relationships, and different fates. This raises the question of whether the Griffins we follow are even the original versions of these characters, or just one set among infinite possibilities. Brian's character provides another piece of this cosmic puzzle. He's a dog who walks upright, drives cars, drinks alcohol, and engages in complex philosophical discussions. The show treats this as perfectly normal, but the implications are horrifying when you consider the biological impossibility of his existence. Brian isn't just an anthropomorphic cartoon character. He's an aberration, a violation of natural law that somehow exists within this distorted reality. Brian's atheism becomes particularly significant in this context. He's the only character who consistently questions the nature of existence and reality. His philosophical discussions with Stewie often touch on themes of mortality, consciousness, and the meaning of existence. It's as if Brian is the only character who recognizes that their reality is fundamentally wrong, yet he's trapped within it just like everyone else. The show's treatment of religion and spirituality adds another layer to this mystery. Characters regularly encounter divine beings, travel to heaven and hell, and interact with supernatural forces. These aren't metaphorical episodes or dreams. They're presented as literal experiences within the show's canon. Death himself is a recurring character, depicted as a fallible being who can be tricked, bargained with, or even temporarily replaced. This suggests that the afterlife in the Family Guy universe is just as chaotic and rule-bending as the mortal realm. Peter's encounters with God reveal perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this reality. God is portrayed as incompetent, petty, and frequently absent from his duties. He makes mistakes, gets involved in trivial disputes, and seems to have lost control of his own creation. If God himself is fallible and chaotic in this universe, it explains why reality operates with such inconsistent and disturbing rules. The chicken fights represent another crucial element in understanding the true nature of this reality. Peter's battles with Ernie the giant chicken aren't just random comedy sequences. They're reality-breaking events that cause massive destruction across Quahog, yet somehow never result in permanent consequences. Buildings are destroyed, innocent people are presumably killed, and the entire infrastructure of the town is regularly devastated. Yet everything returns to normal by the next episode, as if these catastrophic events never happened. This suggests that Quahog exists in a state of constant reset, where major traumatic events are simply erased from collective memory. The townspeople continue their lives as if nothing happened, which implies either mass amnesia or the existence of multiple parallel realities that overlap and replace each other. The chicken fights might actually be tears in the fabric of reality itself, moments when the artificial nature of their world becomes visible through the chaos. The cutaway gags provide even more evidence of reality distortion. When Peter begins a story with his characteristic phrase about a time that's worse than something else, the narrative literally shifts to a completely different reality. These aren't just flashbacks or memories. They're alternate dimensions where different rules apply and different versions of history have played out. The fact that Peter can access these realities at will suggests he has some level of interdimensional awareness or control. Some of these cutaway realities are obviously fictional, referencing movies, television shows, or historical events. But others seem to be genuine alternate versions of the Family Guy universe where small changes have created dramatically different outcomes. This creates a multiverse structure where Peter's consciousness can jump between realities, experiencing different versions of events and bringing that knowledge back to his primary timeline. Meg's role in this cosmic horror becomes clearer when you examine how other characters treat her. The family's abuse of Meg isn't just mean-spirited humor. It's ritualistic and consistent across all timelines and realities. Even in alternate universes where other aspects of their lives are different, the treatment of Meg remains constant. This suggests she serves some kind of specific function in maintaining the stability of their reality. Some theories propose that Meg is actually the anchor point that keeps their chaotic universe from completely falling apart. Her suffering might be the price paid for the family's immortality and reality-bending abilities. The more they abuse her, the more stable their impossible existence becomes. This would explain why even when Meg tries to improve her situation or gain acceptance, the universe seems to conspire against her, forcing her back into her role as the family scapegoat. Lois presents her own mysteries. Despite being married to Peter and living in the same chaotic reality, she often displays knowledge and abilities that seem beyond her apparent character. She's multilingual, has extensive combat training, has connections to wealthy and powerful families, and occasionally demonstrates skills that suggest a much more complex background than her suburban housewife persona would indicate. Her maiden name is Pewterschmidt, connecting her to a family of extreme wealth and influence. But the show has revealed that the Pewterschmidt fortune comes from sources that are never fully explained. They have connections to Nazi Germany, mysterious business dealings, and enough power to manipulate major political and economic events. This isn't just old money. This is money that comes from sources that operate outside normal human society. Lois's piano playing takes on new significance in this context. Music has always been associated with supernatural and reality-altering powers in mythology and fiction. When Lois plays piano, she often enters a trance-like state where she becomes completely absorbed in the music. Could her playing be some kind of ritual that helps maintain the stability of their distorted reality? Is she unconsciously channeling forces that keep their impossible world functioning? The town of Quahog itself contains numerous locations that defy logical explanation. The Drunken Clam Bar exists in a constant state of flux. Tom Tucker's news station somehow manages to cover every bizarre event that happens in town, no matter how impossible or reality-breaking it might be. The grocery store, the movie theater, and other local businesses seem to have unlimited resources and the ability to accommodate whatever the plot requires. But perhaps most disturbing is Quahog's relationship with the outside world. Characters regularly travel to other cities and countries, yet these locations often seem just as distorted and rule-breaking as Quahog itself. When the family goes to Europe, they encounter the same kind of impossible situations and reality-bending events they experience at home. This suggests that the distortion isn't limited to their hometown, but extends throughout their entire universe. Cleveland's move to Virginia and subsequent return provides another clue to the nature of their reality. During his absence, Cleveland had his own show in a different location with different characters and storylines. Yet when he returned to Quahog, he seamlessly reintegrated into the Family Guy universe as if nothing had changed. This suggests that characters can literally move between different fictional realities while maintaining their essential identities. The evil monkey in Chris's closet represents one of the most obvious supernatural elements that the family accepts without question. This isn't just a monkey that happens to live in their house. It's a malevolent entity that exists partially outside normal reality, able to appear and disappear at will, and possessing knowledge and abilities that suggest it's not bound by the same rules as other characters. When the evil monkey's backstory was finally revealed, it showed a complex history involving betrayal, revenge, and supernatural justice. But the fact that Chris lived with this entity for years without the family taking serious action suggests they're either unable to perceive the true nature of supernatural threats, or they're so accustomed to reality-bending phenomena that they've become desensitized to genuine danger. The show's treatment of violence provides another disturbing window into the nature of their reality. Characters regularly engage in brutal combat, use deadly weapons, and inflict injuries that should result in permanent disability or death. Yet these violent encounters rarely have lasting consequences. Bodies heal impossibly quickly, psychological trauma is ignored, and characters continue their relationships as if attempted murder was just a minor disagreement. This isn't just cartoon violence logic. The show has established that pain and injury do matter in their world. Characters react to pain, seek medical treatment, and sometimes suffer long-term consequences from their actions. But the threshold for what constitutes permanent harm seems to be much higher than in normal reality, suggesting that their physical forms are more resilient or fundamentally different from normal human bodies. The celebrity appearances in Family Guy create another layer of reality confusion. When real celebrities appear on the show, they're often portrayed in ways that are completely at odds with their real-world personas. Some are depicted as evil, others as incompetent, and many are shown in situations that would be impossible in reality. These aren't just parodies or satirical representations. They're presented as literal encounters within the show's universe. This raises questions about the relationship between the Family Guy universe and our reality. Are these actual alternate versions of real people, or are they fictional constructs created by whatever force maintains their distorted world? The fact that these celebrity characters often have knowledge of events from the real world suggests some kind of connection to our reality, but their behavior and circumstances are so different that they can't be the same individuals. Adam West's portrayal as the mayor of Quahog provides the most extensive example of this phenomenon. The real Adam West was involved with the show for many years before his death, playing a version of himself that bore little resemblance to his actual personality. This fictional Adam West had supernatural experiences, engaged in bizarre political policies, and interacted with the Griffin family as if they were real people in his world. The fact that the real Adam West participated in creating this alternate version of himself suggests a blurring of the lines between fiction and reality that extends beyond the show's universe. It's as if the Family Guy reality has the ability to reach into our world and influence real people to participate in its narrative structure. The show's handling of historical events reveals another disturbing aspect of their reality. Characters regularly travel back in time to witness or participate in major historical moments, but their presence often changes the outcome of these events in ways that should have massive consequences for their present-day reality. Yet somehow the timeline always corrects itself, or the changes are ignored in subsequent episodes. This suggests that history itself is malleable in their universe, subject to constant revision and correction by forces that operate outside normal temporal mechanics. The Griffin family's ability to witness and alter historical events without permanent consequences implies they exist outside the normal flow of cause and effect. Stewie's sexual orientation and romantic relationships add another layer of complexity to the reality distortion. The show has never definitively established Stewie's sexuality, leaving it deliberately ambiguous despite numerous hints and references. This isn't just uncertainty about a character's personal life. It's as if Stewie exists in a state of quantum sexuality, where all possibilities remain open simultaneously. When Stewie does engage in romantic or sexual situations, they often involve time travel, alternate realities, or impossible circumstances. His relationship with himself from alternate timelines, his interactions with future versions of other characters, and his romantic encounters with beings from different realities all suggest that normal human relationship dynamics don't apply to him. Brian's romantic relationships follow similar patterns of reality distortion. He's been involved with human women, other dogs, and beings from alternate realities. These relationships are treated as normal within the show's universe, but they represent violations of biological and social norms that should be impossible in any consistent reality. The recurring theme of characters breaking the fourth wall provides perhaps the most direct evidence that they're aware of their fictional nature. When characters make references to the show itself, acknowledge the presence of cameras, or directly address the audience, they're demonstrating consciousness of their status as fictional constructs. Yet they continue to behave as if their reality is genuine and consequential. This creates a paradox where characters are simultaneously aware of their fictional nature and committed to maintaining the illusion of their reality. It's as if they're trapped in a performance they can't escape, forced to continue their roles even though they understand the artificial nature of their existence. The show's treatment of mental illness and psychological trauma becomes particularly disturbing when viewed through this lens. Characters regularly experience events that should result in severe psychological damage, yet they continue functioning as if nothing happened. Peter has been through countless traumatic experiences. Meg has suffered years of abuse and rejection, and Chris has dealt with supernatural threats and family dysfunction that should have lasting psychological effects. Their apparent immunity to psychological trauma suggests either that their minds operate differently from normal humans, or that the reality they inhabit somehow prevents the formation of lasting psychological damage. Either possibility raises questions about the fundamental nature of their consciousness and identity. The economic system of Quahog defies logical explanation. Peter works at a brewery, yet the family maintains a middle-class lifestyle that includes expensive vacations, constant dining out, and the ability to replace destroyed property without apparent financial strain. The cost of living in their reality seems to operate on completely different principles than any real economic system. Local businesses somehow manage to stay open despite constant destruction and the bizarre behavior of their customers. The bank continues to provide services, even though it's regularly robbed or destroyed. The hospital treats impossible injuries and supernatural conditions as routine medical cases. This suggests an economic system that operates independently of normal supply and demand principles. The show's treatment of technology reveals another aspect of their reality distortion. Characters have access to futuristic devices and impossible inventions, yet they also use outdated technology and live in what appears to be contemporary society. Time periods blend together in ways that suggest their reality exists outside normal temporal progression. Stewie's advanced technology coexists with Peter's primitive understanding of basic concepts. Lois uses modern communication devices while also displaying knowledge of historical events that she shouldn't have witnessed. This temporal confusion extends throughout their universe, creating a reality where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. The educational system in Quahog provides another window into the distorted nature of their reality. Chris and Meg attend high school, yet their education seems to consist primarily of bizarre adventures and encounters with supernatural phenomena. Their teachers are often incompetent or malevolent, and the curriculum appears to have no connection to real educational standards. Despite this chaotic educational environment, the characters somehow maintain enough knowledge to function in society. They can read, write, and perform basic mathematical calculations when the plot requires it, yet they also display shocking ignorance about fundamental concepts. This selective competence suggests that knowledge in their reality is distributed based on narrative necessity rather than logical learning processes. Religious and spiritual experiences in the Family Guy universe are treated as literal events rather than matters of faith or belief. Characters regularly encounter angels, demons, divine beings, and supernatural forces as physical presences in their world. These encounters often contradict established religious doctrines and present theological concepts in chaotic and illogical ways. The fact that multiple religious and spiritual systems seem to exist simultaneously in their reality suggests a universe where belief itself shapes existence. Different characters' spiritual experiences reflect their personal expectations rather than consistent universal truths, implying that reality adapts itself to accommodate conflicting belief systems. As we reach the end of this exploration into the hidden depths of Family Guy lore, the picture that emerges is far more complex and disturbing than the surface comedy would suggest. We're looking at a universe where the fundamental laws of reality are constantly in flux, where consciousness and identity operate on principles that defy normal understanding, and where the characters exist in a state of perpetual uncertainty about their own nature and existence. The Griffin family isn't just a dysfunctional cartoon family. They're entities, trapped in a reality that operates outside the normal rules of existence, forced to repeat patterns of behavior while occasionally glimpsing the artificial nature of their world. Their immortality comes at the cost of genuine growth and change. Their relationships are defined by roles they cannot escape, and their reality is maintained through forces they cannot understand or control. This hidden lore transforms Family Guy from a simple, animated comedy into something resembling cosmic horror, where the greatest terror isn't monsters or supernatural threats, but the gradual realization that existence itself might be fundamentally meaningless and arbitrary. The character's ability to laugh and find humor in their situation becomes an act of defiance against the absurdity of their existence, or perhaps the only coping mechanism available to consciousness trapped in an impossible reality. Sweet dreams, and remember that sometimes the most disturbing truths hide behind the most innocent laughter.